So it's now my great pleasure to introduce our final panel for ACFID's 2017 conference, and we're going to be discussing women and leadership here in Australia, but also in the region and in the world, and the issues and challenges and the opportunities for equality and at the decision-making table. Chairing our panel is our outgoing president, Sam Mostyn, and I'm sure you all know that Sam has been a vociferous advocate for women's leadership and was the first female AFL commissioner many years ago, 10 or 12 years ago? 12 years ago. Joining Sam, we have Frances Adamson, the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who was previously an international advisor to Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, and prior to that was Australia's ambassador to the People's Republic of China, but has obviously risen to the top of the diplomatic profession in Australia. Caitlin Figueiredo, the CEO of Late Night Live and youth activist leader of Plan International's Australia, the youngest person ever to win Australia's 100 Most Influential Women Award, and who recently organised the world's largest Act Girls Take Over Parliament program with the Australian Federal Parliament. And some of us who were lobbying up in Parliament a couple of weeks ago saw Caitlin and her colleagues in various offices, including meeting with the Prime Minister and other politicians. Cathy Nasarua, founding board member of the Fiji Association of Deaf and board committee member of their umbrella organisation, the Fiji Disabled Persons Federation, one of our keynote speakers here, and our keynote back again as well, Noelene Nabulivou, so from Diva for Equality. So over to you, Sam.
Thank you very much, Mark, and welcome back. I know you've all had your cornettos, so you've had the sugar hit, you've had the treat, and this is the last session before we close the ACFID 2017 conference and you head home, wherever that might be. And I've had a lovely chat with all of these splendid women on the panel this afternoon, and we've decided we'll do things a little differently. We want to leave you with a lot of energy and a lot of inspiration and a lot of intent, and a lot of you knowing what your agency is going to be when we really seriously address the issue of women in leadership and women leading everywhere. So I'm not going to come to you for questions, I'm terribly sorry. We have just on 40 minutes and I just can't let a single moment pass from this panel. So I'm going to try and cover what I think your questions might be. We're just going to let this rip. And you're going to hear these wonderful women almost riff on some of the themes that have been coming through the conference. I hope you've seen that women have been right up and front, centre, front, leading, doing throughout this entire conference. It's a really wonderful change, I think, for the sector and for ACFID. I am very, very sad to be leaving as your president. I'm now your ex-president, but you are receiving a wonderful, magnificent president in Susan Pascoe. Wonderful to have another woman president. We resolved yesterday to make sure that there will always be gender balance on your board, so we've mandated that. Last year at the AGM, we mandated a deep conversation with the sector about the need for women to be leading right across the sector. After last year's AGM, Mark Purcell and I both wrote to the CEO and board chairs of all the member organisations, exhorting anyone with influence and power, and we can talk a bit about power through this conversation, to get on with the job of promoting women, leading with women, and taking a stand for women. And I just want to remind you of the statistics as they sit today for our own organisations. Across ACFID member organisations, 27 are heads of board, they're women. Of the board members, of the boards of the members, 43% are women. 45% of ACFID members now have a woman chief executive, up from 34% in 2012. It's a great statistic. It's not quite parity, but it's a very good number. But about 2/3 of all employees in our sector are women, often young women, doing a lot of heavy lifting. And you heard why we were so concerned about this in our gender statement again yesterday at the AGM. So we've made great progress. You heard through some of the panels today, particularly from Noelene, that we've had a lot of rhetorical statements about women in leadership. So the question we're going to talk about is, how can we do better? We're going to learn from these women what their advice to you is. They're going to share some personal experiences. I wish we had hours to do this, because this conversation is going to be so enlivening, and we're going to learn so much, because these women, as I said, are just simply extraordinary in everything they have been doing. So my view is, and just to get it off so there's no doubt about it at all, I advocate for this. I'm a big fan of quotas. I've been a quota appointment. I wear that with a badge of honour. I want all women who are ever approached as part of a quota to feel very comfortable and confident that being a quota appointment does not mean you don't have the merit. So I'd love to see the complete abandonment and we heard from so many of our speakers across the course of the conference that women don't need empowering, actually. We are empowered women, we're empowered gender. What we need is opportunity, support, advocacy, the positions to take. But empowering us isn't what we need. We're very empowered women. You've seen the power of the women across the last couple of days. You've also heard in a number of the concurrent sessions about the need for us to really think deeply about intersectionality, that we don't dismiss, as we heard in the last session, a woman who is disabled and a woman, that suddenly she is no longer intelligent or has her own agency or efficacy, that she is brilliant and that she can be a leader, not despite her disability, but because her disability is not how she is defined. It's her mind and her activity and what she does that matters, not her disability. And we'll talk a bit about disability. So we just want to knock all of those old hoary chestnuts on the head and really open this up for a really fresh kind of conversation. So there's a richness here. I actually just want to start with Noelene, because Noelene, you just set this place on fire this afternoon. Your language about, particularly from the Pacific, but really it was a very global comment you made about how every day we go back to our places and we have to remove the cloak of patriarchy, that the idea of the rhetoric versus the reality, we don't need any of that, and that we don't need empowering, we just need to be occupying these positions of power and to be taken seriously, and that may mean that we're prickly and difficult, but we're not going to assimilate, because that's not what inclusion's about. Do you want to just share with us a bit more about what that's going to mean for women leading everywhere?
I mean,
Yep, go.
I think we have to be prickly, and we have to be able to speak, I think, the deep anger and frustration often, and sometimes fury, but we also have to be able to do the other side, which for me is there's work that you can do with humor. We use a lot of humor in our praxis in DFAT for Equality, and the reason for that is when you're going through these days every day, you've got to find ways to keep yourself safe and sane, and you've got to help other women and people to do the same. So for me, this kind of idea of keeping humor and goodwill and love in the middle of your practice is very, very important. We use arts-based approaches. We do these chanting things. You know, one of the things that you can do to disrupt spaces, there's a lot of rooms you go into where the kind of power is set within the room, right? We talked about spaces and it's already set. So for instance, I'll give you a practical example. One of the things that we've been trying to work on for years is how women's organizations from the Pacific could have direct access and discussions with some of the ambassadors in New York, the Pacific Small Island States ambassadors. And so I think it was about 2 years ago, we started something that we're trying to do again. We missed it out last year. Everybody was just too busy with the Oceans Conference and everything. But we're going to do it again this year and following on. And what we did was we came into the room, but we were really trying to make sure that it wasn't this usual us across the room from the ambassadors and you have all the power and we speak to you and then you give us a little bit of your input back. And the way that we did that was by speaking to what we have in common with each other. And they're a long way away from home in New York. And so we did some singing together. One of the people in the collective has a guitar. Anybody in the Pacific thinks they can sing? How many people here think they can sing? You can disrupt a space really, really quickly when you have 8 ambassadors who are singing We Shall Overcome. It's a good way to open a conversation. So for us, you know, I mean, you've got to be careful how you do this, and it's done with respect and a little bit of joy and good energy. But for me, this is the thing, you know, disruption doesn't always have to be about the anger. It can be about just shifting the power and negotiating with each other in new ways. So I think I just start with that.
No, I love that, Noelene, and the language you used in your keynote about standing in our power and actually being proud in our power and overcoming that fear, but needing our sisters around us to do that confidently was so well made. Cathy, in the last session, you spoke about what you think has to happen to change the role for, or the place of women with disability. You talked about people to people, things that will change because people understand one another. It was a very special moment, I thought, in the last panel, and I really enjoyed hearing you talk about what it's like to be a woman who's led an organisation for the deaf and what you've learnt as a woman leading with disability, but leading with great power and sense of self. Could you share your thoughts about how we're going to make transformational change with women in disability?
Okay. Wow, there's so many people here.
You're in your power.
And men and women together. Okay, my vision. I'd like to thank women with disabilities for teaching me about how my life can be. I want to thank my family for their support in encouraging me to do these things. Even though I did have family responsibilities at the time, I had my whole family support me. So I could go off and learn many, many different things. I really enjoyed the camaraderie with women and learning about leadership. I had no idea, but being able to learn from others and how I then can share it with other deaf women that don't have these opportunities. So being able to meet with my friends, bringing them together, letting them know that they can be trained, they can learn, and giving them that confidence in being able to be part of this. Understanding, maybe they've had schooling problems, maybe they've not had language or access to language, looking at those things that have challenged them, being able to come together and discuss as women with disabilities and solving the problems that we're facing. Being able to go to the Human Rights Commission, the Federation of Women's Rights and their movement, linking in with these mainstream organisations, being able to get support, rolling up our sleeves and feeling that we are able to contribute and not feeling that we are oppressed, that we can improve and become stronger. We can live the lives that we want, the same as anybody else. We can marry, we can move out of our family homes and demonstrate that to the community. I came from a very poor family. I thank God for giving me the opportunities that I've had to link in with others so that they can then use me as a role model. I want to be able to demonstrate to them what transformations they can make in their lives and develop as strong women and equal to others.
Thank you, Cathy. Cathy, thank you. You are so strong. To feel your power, just as you speak, is inspiring. So thank you, and thank you for everything you've done through the course of the conference the last 2 days. It's meant a lot for us to sit and listen to your story, so thank you. Caitlin, I read about you described as a force of nature, and then I read about you more deeply, and then I looked at you from afar, and that doesn't come close. A force of nature doesn't come close to describing Caitlin. You've known what you've wanted to do from the time you were 6, when your grandparents told you or gave you a sense of what your mission in life has been, and you might like to speak about that. But you're not just a youth activist, you're not just a young woman with ambition for the world. You want to be the youngest Prime Minister of Australia, and you know that means that you've got to get there before you're 37. You then want to be the Secretary General of the United Nations before you are 70. So your canvas is well set out. There's a great trajectory there of ambition, which is what we need to hear about, that young women actually can set high ambitions. But along the way, you've dealt with some really, really significant issues in your own life. You are living with mental health challenges that you deal with and speak about so proudly. You've worked out all sorts of things to do with your life, and you're studying crazily, you're teaching. You know, this is a remarkable set of ambitions that you have, and you carry it with such great power, but such empathy for everybody else through your teaching. So I guess the audience would just love to know, from a young woman, how are we going to move to transformational change where there's full diversity and the power not just of women but other forms of diversity leading and showing us what good leadership looks like?
So before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that we are on First Nation land. So this is a little bit nerve-wracking for me, or very humbling for me, because I only started working in the space when I was 19, so it was only about 2-3 years ago. And it was because of one woman in particular in this room who's also a young woman who is the biggest idol of my life. And that is Sash, your new board director.
Fantastic.
She gave me my start. When I first came to World Vision, I was a basketball player. I had absolutely no leadership experience. I had no idea how to work in an organization, working on topics of poverty eradication. That was completely foreign to me. The only thing that I had going for me was the fact that I did have my stories of my family. My Ava and Avazina, they were driven out of Kenya when my dad was very little, and they sought refuge in Australia. And my bedtime stories, they were not stories of Disney princesses or princes. They were stories of real people, of real issues. And so my family taught me that the greatest thing I can do with my life is to serve my community. But not only my community here in Australia, but my global community. And so that is when I decided at 6 years old that no matter what I was going to do in my life, I knew I had to do something with my life, and I had to become Prime Minister. So I was very ambitious from a young age, you could definitely say. And it was because of SASH, and it's actually because of ACFID for giving us an opportunity to launch the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 that I got my start. So SASH and the Campaign for Australian Aid, they came to us, and Tony's in the room, I think he might remember this. It was a very awkward meeting. So basically I had been given a directive to have a global goals party. Generally, party is like a couple of your mates in front of the TV, you have pizza, that's about it. I took that as, I'm going to launch the largest sustainable development goals in Australia. So what I did was, in front of Tony, who I didn't know was actually the head of the Campaign for Australian Aid at the time, I got into a lot of trouble when I said this. I said, okay, I'm going to call up every single member of parliament. I'm going to call up every single ambassador, every person who was influential in relation to the goals. I'm going to get them in one room. We're going to have a panel discussion, but more than that, we are going to get young people to organise it themselves. And we did that. We were able in one day to completely redefine how young people in Australia were going to take action on the global goals. We were there as partners. And what I have learned in the last 2 years is that if organisations had faith in young people, but not only knowing that we are a change for good, in particular young women, but to give us a bit of power, that is when we are able to take our ambitions, our dreams, our hopes, our ability to connect people, bring us along for the journey. And that's how we can move mountains. We can do things that no one else has ever thought of. You know, we did this recently, as Mark mentioned, at Parliament House. You know, Zoe, my colleague, came to me at the beginning of this year and she's like, hey, Caitlin, you know, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I'm like, well, I'm going to be Prime Minister. And she said to me, great, well, I want you to do a girls' takeover of the Prime Minister's office. No, not an easy thing to do. But I went to her and I'm like, okay, Zoe, I'm going to do something even better than that. I want to beat Justin Trudeau, because I heard he took over the world's largest parliament takeover in Canada, and I think Australia is better than Canada. So I'm going to create the world's largest takeover. And that's what we did. My colleague Ash and I, we moved mountains. We contacted over 100 MPs and senators. We followed up with the parliamentarians ourselves. I literally was chasing the Prime Minister and Bill Shorten for 3.5 months, calling them literally every single day, saying, you need to be a part of this. You have to be here. Girls' rights are important. You need to listen to us. And they did. This is something, we achieved something that I don't think any other organisation in the world has achieved. And it's all because young women were at the helm. And that is my call to all of you. With your organisations, you have a lot of power. But you can take what you're working on and explode that by including young people, including young women, and making them partners.
I think that deserves a huge round of applause. It's wonderful to hear you call out your mentor, Sash, and I have many sadnesses in leaving ACFID, but a big one is that I won't be sitting around a table learning and listening from Sash around the table as our youngest board member, and delighted that she was voted in at the AGM yesterday. There'll be lots of learning that we're going on and sharing around the board as a result of her arriving. So lovely that you called her out. And I think we would all love to see you as Prime Minister. And particularly as you'd be the first Prime Minister when asked how much time have you got in the day for things, and you would say you have as much time in the day as Beyonce, so use it. Because that's what you tell people, that if Beyonce can get to do stuff, so should we, which I love. I love the fact that you have such an optimistic view and you have such power. So thank you. Caitlin, in order for us to see women in positions of power like the Prime Minister's office, properly held, I'd like to just now turn to a groundbreaker herself with Frances Adamson, because Frances has done something that no other woman has done. She is the only woman to have led the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We still have never had a woman head of our missions in London after 105 years, Washington, Tokyo or Jakarta, amongst many, many other posts, but they're the big ones. And Frances has been the first to call that out as unacceptable. She has shown extreme bravery, I think, and stepping into this space as one of the most senior bureaucrats in the country, to call this out and to put herself, I guess, in the mix about what's got to change. And Frances, I was in New York for the most recent UN General Assembly, and we had a panel of 5 leading women from around the world, the Chief Executive of the UN Foundation and others, and we were talking about the women's role in the Sustainable Development Goals. And we'd heard throughout the whole of the rest of the SDGs discussion that women should be pretty happy if we get SDG 5 done, because that would mean that gender equality was right, and we would be the recipients of SDG 5. Fabulous. Thank you. And the women I was talking to said, we don't need to be recipients of anything. We don't need to be empowered. We have got to be driving every one of the 17 goals. If there aren't women driving every one of those goals, forget it. So the power of women behind every goal. And yes, we'd love to get to gender parity, but we're not just simply recipients of one goal. And it's a big lead up to ask you the question, given the role you have, given your statements about the lack of and the failure of a system to let women rise, what's got to change significantly that actually pinpoints the problems and gets women moving? Because we know in your department there are a lot of women, and we see a lot of them here connecting to ACFID. There is a strategy to boost women in DFAT. You've embraced targets. If you were to push really hard, what's going to see this accelerate so that you won't be alone, and we'll actually see a chance for Caitlin to take heart, and all the young women in this room, that we can take the reins of power?
Well, Sam, thank you very much indeed for that. And I'm sorry I've joined you rather late in the piece, but let me just, as I know Connie Fierravanti-Wells did yesterday, let me just say how much ACFID is a valued partner. Your member organisations are very valued partners for me, for all of my DFAT colleagues, and of course that includes many at our posts overseas with whom I know you and your members work very closely. So, you know, we do look forward to working with Susan, of course,
Fantastic.
but we want to say a proper goodbye
Thank you.
to you. And let me just say how pleased I am to be sitting up here with Noelene, with Caitlin, and with Cathy, who I had the privilege of meeting earlier in the week. You know, how do we do it? Well, you know, I start in the way that I suppose women of my age do, with remembering what it was like when I was Caitlin's age. And I do hope I'm still Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade when Caitlin is the youngest female Prime Minister ever, or indeed the youngest Prime Minister ever. I do know, though, that there are quite a number of young Australian girls around the country, one in my own household, only 16, who would love to get there too. So I think there's a bit of competition, which is a very healthy thing, as we know. But as I say, look, you know, my experience, there was a moment, that moment was the passage of the Sex Discrimination Act in 1984. A number of women and men in the room are possibly old enough to remember it. And I joined the Department of Foreign Affairs in 1985. And probably, actually, the only reason I was accepted in as a graduate trainee in 1985 was because DFAT's selection practices had to change as a result of the Sex Discrimination Act. Not that they had been overtly discriminatory before, but they had been discriminatory in their effect. So I count myself as a beneficiary of legislation, and I don't think we should underestimate the power of legislation to drive change, either in this or in our own countries. Now, you talk about DFAT, and you talked about, I mentioned to you those overseas positions filled by ambassadors, not yet been filled by women. I had the privilege, obviously, of becoming the first female ambassador in Beijing. I've been followed by Jan Adams. I sent the Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, just last week, a map of the world showing the places, I think there are 12 of them, where we've never had a female head of mission. She's very committed, as am I, to changing that. I know you've had a discussion about power, about empowering. And we often say with power comes responsibility. And I would say, for me personally, having become secretary after 31 years as a diplomat, is that with the responsibility of being secretary of the department comes a great deal of power to do good, to make change, to bring about the opportunities that you're talking about. Now, we have targets for women in leadership. I'm delighted, though, at the very top leadership group, the deputy secretaries and I, there are 6 of us, and we're 50-50. And that's a great thing. We are a much stronger leadership group as a result of that. It gets a little bit harder at the levels, 2 levels immediately below. These are called bands in the public service. I won't sort of bore you with the details, but below that, at the executive level and below, we've got 56% women, and very, very capable women who are just sort of charging through the system, if you like. But we can't make the mistake that I made in 1985, and my cohort, more women than men, joined the department that year for the first time ever, 14 and 12. We thought that marked the beginning of a permanently changed world, and it didn't. So I've got a second chance to try and fix this. I very much want to use it. But it's not a question of me using it on my own. The way to change it, I'm absolutely convinced after a year in the job, is to do it in a very collaborative way, really driven by colleagues throughout the organisation, men and women, because it can't be about me, because one day I'll be gone. It has to be about almost everything but me, so that it can become entrenched and we get the sort of permanent change that is, well, permanent change obviously will be irreversible, but so much of what we've done, I think, and again, I hate to say it because you'd want to think at your age, Caitlin, that you're charging on and it's going to be upwards, ever upwards, but the realities in the past have been that that's not always the case. So I think, disruptive change, yes, that's one of the ways that we can do it. I've got to say to Noelene, I don't do prickly as a diplomat, but I'm very happy for people to do prickly around me. Because that can be very effective.
Yes.
And of course there's there's a tremendous role in a lot of things we do. I mean, if you look at our relationship with China, for example, a lot of the really good communication and change in our people-to-people relationship is being driven by the Australia-China Youth Association, where everyone on both sides, the Chinese and the Australian side, speak both languages, use them interchangeably. So youth is part of it, disruptive change is part of it, but I think, you know, that the opportunity, not just the opportunity, the responsibility to use power, not only internally, you know, it's a nice little, one almost might say boutique issue, you know, women in leadership in DFAT. It's very serious for us, but in the overall scheme of things, it's not necessarily going to be a world changer. But the connection between what we do internally and what we do externally through our aid program, you know, with the SDGs, implementing those, working with partners such as you, and I'm sure you've had lots of discussions about how all of this can work much better in what we deliver, what we design, what we invest in, if we do it with women involved from the very, very beginning.
Yeah, I think a round of applause for the groundbreaking work that Frances is doing. I'll stay with you for a second. I'll stay with you for a second, Frances. I just want to, have been a number of things. I know Dermot O'Gorman in the last session asked a question which was really well received and seen as important that men ask these questions, which was, it's, you know, we're doing all this stuff, we're all getting very strong, but men are part of this solution, and working with our men colleagues matters. And I know that you've done work on unconscious bias. I know that you're the leader of the public service, Martin Parkinson, heading PM&C, has worked hard to deal with these more subtle forms of discrimination and blocking. Could you just share with us a little bit about that aspect of it? Because targets and all the things we've been talking about is one thing, but there are so many more subtle things going on. And I'm going to come back to Noelene in a minute, who talked a lot about how we're seen through certain lenses. But I think you've seen that, particularly in DFAT and beyond.
We certainly have. And I mean, look, our unconscious bias, we're not the first ones to discover it. I imagine everyone in the room, probably in many organisations, have done what we've done only relatively recently. And let me admit, you know, in front of all of you, that when I did the test myself, that speed, you know, looking at the pictures, matching them with the words, I came out, to my absolute horror, with a very strong unconscious bias in favour of male stereotypes in leadership positions. I mean, I was truly shocked. It was late at night, and I like to think my reflexes were a bit slow by that point, but I can't ignore the fact that that was the result. And although that wasn't a driver of anything particularly for me, it's become one, and across, well, if not the whole of DFAT shortly will be, we've all been undergoing this training. All of our selection committees and panels are required to undergo unconscious bias training. But it's not just unconscious bias training in relation to your male, female, it's in relation to all aspects of our diversity, and it's in relation to disability and LGBTI, I mean, all conceivable aspects, opening our minds to these things, opening the minds of our, you know, selection panels, if you like, which helps us reach our targets, to the way we judge merit, for example. Now, I'm a special advisor to the Male Champions of Change group. Last week, in fact, they put out a publication on everyday sexism, which doesn't seem to have got as much attention as I think it should. I mean, it's obviously the Brits are experiencing a bit of it at the moment for anyone who's watching the news, but it's a really useful thing to read. You know, their publications on the merit trap, for example. All of these things, they're so subtle and interlinked. And what I've discovered, and what I'm very happy to do within DFAT, and I have a lot of support from female and male colleagues at every level of the organisation, is to try and link these things and to create the sort of opportunities that, frankly, all of our workforce, not just the Australians, the diplomats amongst us, but our locally engaged staff across, you know, 108 posts around the world. This is all about them as well. Yeah. It's not just about us.
Yeah. No, thank you. And you mentioned what's happening with the Brits at the moment. So we're seeing those men having to account and atone for their behaviour. Late breaking news, the next two male Hollywood superstars who are now caught up in pretty persuasive allegations are now Kevin Spacey and Dustin Hoffman. And you can expect that to continue, I imagine, and terribly depressing stuff that's coming out, but it's coming out, and it's been held back for so long because of these biases and because of the bystander effect. And so it's going to come out with a rush, and we've got to protect, I think, our younger women to know that this doesn't signal the end of it. This is actually the beginning of a real inclusion and handling these things properly. What I'd like to do now, I'm going to start with Noelene and come across the panel. Feel free to share anything that you want to at a deeply personal level, but Noelene, I just was really struck. I was mesmerised by your presentation because you just spoke to truth, and you speak truth to power. And I think we all felt that in the room throughout your wonderful presentation. But you made the very strong point that we've got to refuse to be spoken about through a lens, through our gender lens, our sexuality lens, our disability lens, that you want women and everyone to be seen through their interest in the economics of their place, of the ecology of their place and of the world. And maybe if you could start there and then share with us some of your thoughts that will bring us home to this group about really what sits at the heart of your advocacy, and I guess a sense of the future, if we get this right.
You know, one of the things I think that motivates me more than anything, and that moves me in this work, is the idea of bodily autonomy and integrity. And for me, that idea, you know, when I came across it, because some of my earliest sets of work were around sexual and reproductive health and rights, you know, and you come into the movement and you find something that, you know, that interests you. And so I had an interest around ecology, of course. I always did, no matter where I was, but I also really was interested in sexual and reproductive health and rights. And I had my own very complex journey of sexuality and if I could be out in public, and what that meant to me and what that meant to my partner and to her family and my family. And so that's been, you know, a lifelong journey. So one of the things that for me became very, very clear is it's impossible to talk about the rights related to your social, economic, or ecological or environmental rights if you don't feel like you are able to claim and to feel that you are a person of worth. And, you know, in the feminist movement, we talk a lot about this, but I feel like sometimes we don't get how to move it from the idea of it through to what does that look like from a policy position? What does that look like when we have to think about that in terms of every person in our society matters? Okay, what does that mean for a social platform and a social floor? And what does it mean for a woman who's doing double and triple burden? You know, one of the stories that always just breaks my heart is women who are working in a fisheries factory in Levuka, and sitting with them, talking to them about, you know, the long days that they work in the fisheries industry, and that they're really proud of the amount that they can bring back into their families, but doing, you know, 9 to 12-hour day shifts, okay, and trying to work out how many breaks is enough, so negotiating for that. And then all the changes that the fisheries industry is going through, so there's already a systemic part to it, but your body's in the middle of that. And then you come out at the end of your, you know, 8-hour shift or 9-hour shift, you might do overtime, and then there's no buses for you. There's no way that you can get home because the state hasn't thought about the fact that you coming out of that, it's late at night, and you've got to then get back to a village that might be, what, an hour or two's walk away. So then off you go, you walk, you get home, and then there's things that have to be done, right? The rest of the family's asleep, you doing stuff at home, you might have 4 to 5 hours of sleep, and these women crying, talking about how exhausted they are after years of doing this, getting up before everybody else, and then doing all the care and reproductive work that we do as women in our social spaces and in our economic spaces. But not having that reflected anywhere in our social and economic policies. And don't get me wrong, this is not just about Fiji, this is everywhere around the world. This is about how we value what every individual human body is putting into a system that is supposed to then also take care of us, in theory, right? So we talk a lot about social contracts, and for me, I want to know then, what is the social contract that the state has with us? And how do we think about pensions? If you've not been in that workplace, in the formal workplace, maybe you've been running a small family farm, what happens, like Lily talked about, what happens if say you're in a hetero relationship and your husband passes away? And you are then told by uncles or brothers that you don't have a place in that family home. This happens every day to women around the world. So what's our policy response to that? And then how are we going to have adequate childcare? Because it doesn't matter if you're in a north state or south state. We have to find ways to keep our bodies going while we're doing the care and reproductive work that we do in economies. And as a feminist, I want to know not just that there's better health care and childcare in place, but I want to know how men and boys and others, all other genders, are going to help me with this. So it's also about the changes in the way that we see work and we see society. You know, like, so one of the things that I'm trying to think through a lot more and that we're working on is, what's the link between sexual and reproductive health and bodily autonomy, but then into economics and society? What are progressive taxes that help? What are conditional or unconditional transfers that can be made, social contracts with women of all kinds? One of the other things that I thought is useful to talk about now is, you know, it's all very well for us to talk about the rights of citizens, but who's even regarded as a citizen? In 7 Pacific small island states, there are still LGBTQI people who are criminalized for who they are. And it's not just about Pacific small island states. We've talked about today about some of the social contract work that you're doing right now as people in Australia, and it's happening all around the world. But that's a core human rights issue. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is, how is it possible that we can have Papua New Guinea Parliament where there's not one woman in the parliament? How is that possible today? And it's not just about Papua New Guinea. It's about many, many places around the world where we still think this is acceptable. Yes, we have our first president, Hilda Heine, but I'm so tired of seeing photos, and it's not just about in the Pacific, right? I see it here as well, about endless photos of just men in positions of power. And I want to know how we do this as development and humanitarian organizations so we don't have man panels. I'm so sick of them. Just as I'm sick of seeing only all white panels or all older people panels. You know, like, we've got to really talk about how do we do this intersectionality in a really real way. And not so it's like social engineering and you just pick up, you know, like, oh, this looks good. But I'm thinking about Adani, right? So at a really deep level, let's think about this. Wonderful activist who was here yesterday. I hope you're still around. Thank you. You really gave me some drive. But I also know that SEED, Indigenous, there's some amazing young women leaders, Indigenous women, who are driving the Stop Adani movement. And I would have loved to see them here. So next year, if I come again, if I get invited, I would really love to see much more diverse panels. And I think I'll end with that, but just to say, you know, it requires certain things in solidarity as well with not just Pacific small island states, but then those outside. I always speak from context, but temporary special measures. How do we get this into place? How are we going to? I'm so tired of seeing we have the Pacific Leaders Gender Equality Declaration, we have this declaration, we have that declaration, we have the Commission on the Status of Women, we have agreed outcomes, and we work really hard to make them meaningful. But somebody needs to start to work with us broadly. All the mainstream need to make sure that it's our joint struggle until we get, it's, you know, I said to the triennial, to me, it's not wise, it's foolish, it's not effective, it doesn't work, to have one gender that represents all of us. How is that possible in 2017? And one of the things I'll say...
I have to get you to close.
Yeah, okay. One of the things I just want to say is, okay, in terms of the Pacific, please don't do this thing where you come and you say, yes, but that's about the culture at the local. We are working really, really hard to shift that, so please help us to do that. Because if you become the ones who become the gatekeepers as well, then that doesn't help us to move what we need to move in our own societies too. So thank you.
Thank you, Noelene. Thank you. No, it's never too long. We don't have a lot of time, but just before we leave, I hope you all have taken the panel pledge for your organisations, and there's never an all-male panel, or perhaps an all-white panel, or an all-North panel. You do have to work at it, and then it's not just putting a panel together and constructing it. It's an active inclusivity. and to actually respect and listen to the people you have brought together. And as you said, it can be prickly, it can be uncomforting, it shouldn't feel like an assimilated group. So if we take that away and you're seeing the kind of panel that you can create very, very constructively. Caitlin, share us, we're going to bring this home now, so share something with us about your hopes and the things you've experienced that are worth really sharing with this audience. They're about to leave and go back to their places, and are really interested in how to make a place that you want to go and lead look. Or anything you want to share with us.
Yeah. I've been really lucky at my age to be able to work both locally, nationally, and internationally, in particular with the United Nations. And for a long time, we continuously hear that women have to be at the forefront of change. But as we know, women are not one homogenous group. You can't just have one type of women, like you said, representing all of us, representing half of the world's population. We need that diversity, whether it's religious, it's different genders, different ethnicities. We need those type of women at the boardrooms. We need them at the United Nations defending us in our politics. You know, to be in Australia right now and to know that we are slipping in regards to our political equal representation, that is really disappointing. But the good news is, you're currently with both the Prime Minister and the shadow leader out of the country, we actually have Julie Bishop as our acting Prime Minister. We have a female deputy shadow leader. Yeah, we have the Chief Justice who is also a woman. Look across the pond. We have Jacinda. She is 37 years old. She's
beaten you there.
She beat me. So that gives me hope.
Yeah, good.
She gives me hope. So what I'd like to say is change is possible. We are seeing it in our country, in our region, around the world. But as the development sector, we also need to look within ourselves, within our own organisations, and look critically and see the spaces where we need to improve. We need to look at our boards, we need to look at our senior leaders, and we also need to look at the procedures that we have which are actively excluding women. Like, for example, making sure that we have paid maternity leave, making sure that men are encouraged to be equal parents. We need to make sure that if we don't have the money, because generally that's the issue, if we don't have the money to have equal pay for women, why don't you just lower the pay for men? Make it equal that way. You'll save money, put that money back into your programs. Solution. Fantastic. So on that, I'll leave it.
Thank you. Please, Sarah. Now, just before I turn to Frances and Cathy, many of you have asked how you can clap for Cathy and for others. I'd like us to think that for both Frances and Cathy, we can all do a clap in solidarity rather than our clap. So when Frances is finished, the way you do that, maybe you could teach us, Cathy. You just do that. And if the whole room is doing that after Frances and Cathy, we know that you're really, really getting into it. So let's try that. Frances.
Well, the pressure's on. Look, I too was going to mention the point that Noelene mentioned about Papua New Guinea. I mean, there were 3 women in the last Papua New Guinea Parliament. There are none now. We worked with over 200 potential women candidates for several years ahead of this last election in the hope that the numbers might increase. Now, they haven't, and we're going to have to look very hard at how we can work more effectively in partnership with Papua New Guineans to try to change that, because it's just not acceptable. It really isn't, and we've got to say that. They say it too, but the outcome is bad. So we absolutely have to accept that. In the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I know Sam's seen this, and by the way, I just wanted to mention, Caitlin said sort of somewhat disparagingly beforehand, I think, that she'd been a basketballer and was slightly dismissive of sport. And I just want to say that Sam and I both know, because when we were Caitlin's age, we were competing against each other in the sport of rowing. I think we both learned a lot about leadership in what was once a male-dominated sport. Yeah. So, you know, basketball's pretty good too. So, you know, I think sport teaches you a lot about teamwork and actually a lot about leadership. In the department, there are photographs of 39 of my male predecessors as Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Secretary of the Department of Trade. Now, you know, my photograph is there now, and people tell me, colleagues tell me, that that gives a lot of colleagues, including a lot of my female colleagues, hope that the future might be different from the past. So, you know, don't underestimate the power of one to change things, even as we regret that there are no women in the Papua New Guinean Parliament.
Yeah.
Something else that DFAT's done, again, this was under Peter Varghese' leadership, and I mentioned it, it almost sounds too minor to mention, but it's not actually, because for many, many years, for the whole of our history, including our history in the RGKC building, all of the meeting rooms and function rooms in the department were named after men or after flowers. And I've got to say, I'm not very good on flowers. I could never remember where the begonia room was. And Peter's, well, in fact, the idea of one of our female staff members was that we should recognise the leadership of women over the last 40, 50 years actually in the department, and name some of those rooms named after flowers after women. And we've done that with in 8 rooms. And so we've now got the Wensley room and the McGovern room and all sorts of others. And that's been a powerful symbol too. So don't underestimate the power of symbols, don't underestimate the power of one. When you go back to 0, you've got to go back and rethink.
Well done, you. Fantastic. Thank you, Frances. And Cathy, your final comments and observations. Really, your vision for women with disability in the world we've just heard about, where women have advocacy and power and agency and can define their future. Can you just share us your thoughts and hopes?
I feel what Caitlin said. Thinking back, being her age, when I was 18 years old, I became involved, and I was very young, and I see similarities with Caitlin and my experience. It's taken me this long to see real achievement. And back then, I had achieved the Federation in Fiji, the Convention of the Rights for People with Disabilities. Since that time, I've seen a lot more access. People have not had access to information, have not been able to go to university to educate themselves. So I'd really like to thank all of the sponsors that have come from Australia to enable what's happened in Fiji to happen. We have students studying at APTC. They have skills, they have knowledge, and I can see now that deaf people can do this because of your involvement. And DFAT has been our very, very good friend, and I can only extend my thanks to you. And also, I can see there's this comparison with education and what happens with those that don't have education. So the Fijian Association of the Deaf wish to see this spread of education. We want to collect more data. We need to have those people out there that we have not yet been in contact with, to reach out to the rural islands and make sure that they become friends of where we are. So that's what I'd like to see that outreach happen.
We could keep talking for a long time, and I know we need to close the conference and get you all on your way. You can't be what you can't see. You've heard that from all of our speakers, and we've gone as deep as we can today. There's much more to discuss. I hope you leave inspired by the leadership of these extraordinary women. Take heart in the fact that much is going on in our sector to be very proud of, but we can always do much, much more, particularly around the intersectionality questions that have been prominent across the course of the conference. But for right now, I'd like you to thank these extraordinary women and their sharing of their stories and their hopes, and I hope it inspires you.